looking at the question, do you consider yourself a punctual person? And in this lesson, we're going to talk all about punctuality. We're going to talk about whether or not you consider yourself a punctual person, what time really means in different cultures, because this is actually going to give you some insights into American culture because it's actually different in different cultures. Punctuality is a cultural construct. So we're going to talk all about that. And we're going to talk about related questions. But first, as we get started and as you guys come in and introduce yourselves, I want to give you a couple of stories of situations related to punctuality that have happened to me in my past history. And of course, as always, this is a live lesson, but if you are watching the replay, I would love to hear your feedback and your comments afterwards. So please be sure to leave a comment and participate. I always respond to you. I love to hear your insights if you watch the replay as well. Okay, so many years ago, this was in 2010, I had moved from California to Rhode Island, and then I was moving to Boston. And so I was doing a short-term job in Providence, Rhode Island, and I was trying to move to Boston. So I was interviewing for jobs. And Providence is about 1 or 2 hours from Boston, depending on the way that you get there. And so it's a little bit stressful when you're trying to have a job interview and you're driving from far away. So I had several job interviews where I had to drive about an hour, 2 hours. There's a lot of traffic in Boston. It's a major city, like many of you are familiar with in your own countries. And what happened is I had a job interview kind of in the outskirts of Boston at a university. And it's funny because if I had gotten this job, I probably wouldn't be teaching you guys now because it was a job that wasn't teaching. I ended up taking a teaching job. So it's kind of funny how life works out. In any case, I want to tell you guys what happened. So this job was on a college university campus, a really large, well-known university in the Boston area. And I was early. I gave myself plenty of time to get there on time because I consider myself a punctual person. And I gave myself plenty of time to be on time. But I arrived in this building where the interview was in the middle of nowhere. Like it was impossible to find. It was on some side street. It was one tiny little building. It didn't even show up on the map. So here I am dressed in my interview clothes, ready to go on this job interview, and I can't find the place. And at that time, I probably wasn't practicing yoga quite as much as I do now, so I was a little bit stressed and anxious, and you guys can let me know in the comments if you relate to this story. So I was getting more stressed, like, this is a terrible impression for your job interview, you're going to be late, like I was watching the clock, the time tick by, and because American culture, punctuality is really important, above all when you're having a job interview. So in the end, I ended up having to call the office and I said, I'm here, I'm nearby, I don't know where your office is. And I think they might have sent somebody to come and find me. So it was a really funny, they were actually had a really good sense of humor about it. They understood, it was no big deal. And it actually, the interview went quite well because as soon as I noticed they didn't mind that I was late, I relaxed and the job interview went fine. But this is really important to understand. Punctuality, being on time, is super important in American culture, above all in job interviews. And so the funny part of that story next is that after that interview, I did get invited to come back because I was actually one of their top candidates for this position. And what happened is I had already started my job teaching in Boston, and I didn't realize at this point I was taking the bus, and the bus only ran once an hour. So I arrived to the bus and I think I had to wait 25 minutes, but I was already late to my second interview. And my second interview was with HR, which is human resources. So I'm trying to meet with human resources who tend to be even more strict than a potential employer. I'm meeting with human resources. I'm one of the top candidates for this position. And I was late to the interview again. And it was funny because then I had another interview with the people in the office and they said, we spoke to one of your references, and your references are people who speak about your experiences working with them. And we asked her if you're a punctual person, and she said that you're a punctual person. I am a punctual person. It just happened to be that this job was not destined to be my job, and I just couldn't be on time. And Yes, you can imagine. I didn't get the job, but it was really close. She said it was a really tough decision. So, but I do think that if I had been on time for the second interview, it probably would have gone a little bit better. But what can you do? So I love to hear if you guys have had any crazy stories. Oh, there's so many of you joining us live. I'm going to greet you guys, but let me know if you've had any crazy stories about punctuality like that. So, and let's talk about why it's important to be on time to a job interview. Let's talk a little bit about time in American culture. So the thing that you really need to understand when people would ask you a question, the question we're starting with today, just to show you guys again, is do you consider yourself a punctual person? This is a question that you may or may not be asked in a job interview because it really depends on the office. It really depends on where the position is and how easy it is to arrive to the office on time. When I lived in New York, my bosses usually showed up 45 minutes to an hour late, and they really didn't mind if we were late. They didn't love it because obviously you want your employees to be on time, but they were more flexible. But in other cities where your commute is shorter, like when I lived in Rhode Island, there was no real reason to be late to that job. So a lot of times in job interviews, people ask you, do you consider yourself a punctual person? And they want to hear some sort of stories that you show up on time. Now, this is especially important in jobs where you need to be on time. As a teacher, if I'm the person leading the class, I need to be on time to my job. And that's why I actually get really stressed out when the technology and the lighting is not okay for this video, and it makes me a little bit late to the video because I consider myself a punctual person, but I have a tendency to be a little late, and I'll tell you why that started in just a moment as well. So you want to think about, are you a punctual person? And if you're not a punctual person, maybe it's best to just be honest about it in the job interview. When you live in a city where there's public transportation and buses, people tend to be more flexible because they know that there are things you just can't predict about transportation. Am I right? You guys can tell me if that happens in your cities as well. So people tend to ask, are you a punctual person when you have to be on time? Something I take very seriously is if I'm going to require my students to be on time to class, I want to start the class on time. And this is an interesting thing that happened to me working with people from around the world, is I actually started changing the way that I was teaching my classes because I would try to start with the heaviest thing first, right at 9 o'clock when we started class. And I actually had to change that because I had so many students from countries where punctuality is a little more flexible and they would show up late. So I ended up starting my classes with conversation, which is what I'm kind of trying to replicate with this type of series. I had to start my class a little bit later, like a little more relaxed where they could jump in late, kind of like this kind of lesson, because I expected people to show up late. So a lot of times you want to get the most important thing first, but if you start with the most important thing and everyone shows up later, it's not going to work. And that's why a lot of times people tell stories or they give some sort of philosophy or they give some background before they start a presentation, before I start live videos. I've received a number of kind of negative comments on YouTube like, oh, that's too much talking before your video. Well, it's because it was a live video and I was waiting for people to show up. So you have to kind of understand that Americans would love to start exactly on the hour, exactly on time. But a lot of times you have to wait for people to get notified, for them to open their email, to show up to any sort of meeting. So it's kind of an interesting thing. But a profession like teaching or any situation where you're meeting with people, where people are waiting for you, you need to show up on time. And I'll talk about cultural approaches to time in just a moment. And so a lot of times things like when you're working as a server in the service industry, any sort of construction, things where people all need to be together at the same time to start work, that's where punctuality really matters. As you continue to advance in your career, there's a lot more flexibility for being super, super punctual on time, because if your job doesn't require you to be sitting in the chair at exactly 9 o'clock, people sometimes are a little more flexible. But it can be frustrating. You have to understand the company culture and also the kind of industry culture with regards to punctuality, because sometimes if you're on time, you're actually late, depending on the culture of the company. So we'll talk about that as well in just a moment too. So Leonicio said, this is funny. No, hi dear is also not okay. You need to watch that video. You want to just say hi, Kim. That's really funny. Okay. So let's take a look. So I'm going to look at my notes right now so we can talk a little more about the difference in the cultures. Okay. So yeah, so do you consider yourself a punctual person? You guys let me know in the comments. I'm asking you guys this question as well. Do you consider yourself a punctual person? Another way to ask yourself this question is you can think, is it important for you to be on time? Like, does it matter to you if you're on time or not? Like, is that something that is important to you emotionally for you to be on time? And you can also consider the question, are you usually on time? Are you early or are you late? So here's the thing that I would love to talk about as we talk a little bit more about questions in the when we talk about these questions in the comments, I want you to think about, are you usually on time? So personally, I like to be exactly on time. So if I have to be somewhere at 10:30, I want to start exactly at 10:30. Some people like to be early. They like to be 5 minutes early, 10 minutes early, and that's just the way that they're going to approach being on time. They want to be 5 or 10 minutes early. And people who are late may be 5 or 10 minutes late. But what I'd love to hear from you guys is, in your country and in your culture, how late is considered late? Like in the United States, 15 minutes is late, right? It's like 15, 20 minutes is kind of your maximum. An hour is unforgivable. But as I was preparing to meet with you guys today, I was doing some research and they said that, in some cultures, you can be an hour late, you can be 3 hours late, even a day late for a certain meeting. So I'd love to hear from you guys since we have people from all over the world. I'd love to hear from you if that's what's normal in your culture, what's considered late. So it's important to understand that what's considered late in your culture may not be considered late in other cultures, or it may be considered even early in your culture. And I have some funny stories for you from my experiences living abroad. But lateness is really a cultural construct. But if you're going to be working with an American or most English-speaking countries, you want to try to show up on time, because lateness is considered rude. It's considered a lack of respect. So it's funny because I feel guilty sometimes if I show up late, even to these live videos, or I'm trying to get things organized, because culturally I feel like it's so disrespectful. But people from other cultures are like, whatever, time's flexible, like no problem. So it's something to consider. So I'm going to give you guys a moment to consider that question. Do you think showing up late, like what is late in your culture? How long is late? Like how many minutes late do you have to be, or hours late do you have to be? And I'll tell you my stories in a moment. When I was in college, I studied for a year in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. And so I lived for a year there, and that was when I was 20 years old. So it was a great experience, and it really was my first exposure to really living in another culture. And since then, I've lived in other countries like Chile and Peru, but Argentina was kind of my first exposure. So in Argentina, this was funny. Well, I have a couple of funny stories. In Argentina, an hour is totally cool. Like, I have some fans from Argentina, so if you guys are here, let me know. Like an hour was like, it was kind of expected. Like about an hour, it would be fine. The only time it wasn't okay is if, say, you're waiting for somebody like on the corner of the street and you're just waiting for them to show up, and like that's kind of awkward. You're just like standing on the street for an hour. But an hour was totally fine. And so one of my friends, she's Lebanese American. So she said, oh, in my culture, 'cause from Lebanon, she's like, in my culture, being late's normal. So she was always an hour late. So living in Argentina, like kind of getting used to the city culture, getting used to people being late, like I started being more relaxed about being punctual, because if I would show up first, I would be the only one there and I would wait for a long time. And I remember we went salsa dancing one night and it was supposed to start at like 11 p.m. and it really started at like 2 a.m. because they're definitely nocturnal in Buenos Aires. And that was the thing. You always had to realize like being on time was actually early in Argentina, whereas it was like you missed the whole event if you were if you were that late in the United States. It would be closed. The bars or the clubs would be closed if you showed up 3 hours late in Boston, for example. But so something that happened to me, which I still love, is I was invited to a friend's birthday party when I lived in Argentina. And this was after I'd lived there for a year. So it had been a long time. Like I was familiar with the culture. I understood how it worked. And so I think she said, my birthday party is starting at 10. So I think I showed up at like 10:30, maybe even 10:45, 10 p.m. And I show up and I'm the only one there. And they were like, it was her and one of her good friends. And she said, we knew the American would be the first one to show up. Like they knew. And so it was funny because it was dinner. So I hadn't eaten food. I was hungry. I hadn't eaten because I knew we were going to have dinner at this party. And I show up and I'm 45 minutes late to this dinner and I'm the first person there. People didn't show up for 2 more hours. It was great. I got to spend lots of time with my friend and the few people. I think it was her family. It wasn't even like her friends. They all showed up 2 hours later. They were about 3 hours late to the party because that's like socially acceptable to show up late. And obviously, as we talk about these different things, we talk about punctuality in the office and punctuality to social events is slightly different. But I would love for you guys who are from countries where you might be late to kind of share your stories about how that works for you. So that was my funny story from Argentina. So it definitely made me feel a little more relaxed about time. But over the years, like in New York, you could be more relaxed about time because of transportation. But as I've moved to cities where transportation is more regular, I've had to become more punctual. So I really do take being on time seriously. And I feel guilty if I'm late because it's my culture is to feel guilty. Other cultures, it's like, whatever, you didn't mean to hurt my feelings, no problem. So it's really interesting when you start considering punctuality and how it makes you feel about the other person. So, yeah. And Leoncio says, the Brazilians have the bad habit of not being punctual. Exactly. Yes, I'm sure. And it's a lot of times, I mean, if you're in a city like Rio or Sao Paulo, like you have transportation, like cities tend to have a little more flexibility. But if you live somewhere where it's an easy, regular commute, people don't have a lot of flexibility with punctuality. Hello, Beatrice. Welcome to the live video. I hope you come back. Oh, and I'm glad that you find my channel valuable for learners. I'm excited, guys. We're about to get to 2,000 subscribers, which I'm really excited about because it means a lot of cool people watching these videos. So thank you so much. I'm glad to see you. Okay, so I've asked you guys, and I'd love for a little more participation. I know there's a bunch of you guys watching, so you can be sure to comment with your experiences. Just double checking, making sure everything's working fine. Okay, so I asked, are you usually on time, early, or late? We've talked about what's late in your culture, what's considered to be late. And so, now let's talk about punctuality habits. Okay, so we talked about what's considered late in these different cultures and how it can be considered respectful or disrespectful. So, this is another funny thing that happens in culture as well. If you are going to be late and you know you're going to be late, how do you estimate your time? Like, how do you how late do you say you're going to be? Americans like accuracy. So if I am going to be late, I try to say I'm going to be 7 minutes late. Like, I'll try to be as accurate as possible. But I noticed living in Peru, for example, they always underestimate how much time it's going to take to do something. Like, I remember going for a hike and it was about, like a 25-minute hike to get to this waterfall. And somebody asked, how long is it going to be? Oh, it's just 10 minutes, 15 minutes. It's like, and I asked my friend, I said, why did you say that? And he said, because I don't want them to feel discouraged. It's like, it's 25 minutes of hiking. They need to know how long it's going to take them to get to this waterfall. So it's just a funny thing. So if you're going to be late, do you say, I'm just going to be 5 minutes late, but it actually means 1 hour? Or do you tell them exactly how long it's going to take you to be late? So that's kind of funny too. And the other thing I would like to ask you guys is, when should you apologize about being late? When should you say, I'm sorry for being late? Americans tend to apologize for even 5 minutes late, even if it's not their fault. It's just part of our culture to apologize for being late. But when do you think it's okay to apologize? And I see some comments happening here about, people will never apologize for being late. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. So when should you apologize about being late? And just for anyone joining late to this video, just showing up to this video. We're talking about if you consider yourself a punctual person, which is a question you may sometimes be asked in job interviews, but it's also an interesting, as you can see from this discussion, it's an interesting question to talk about with your friends, to kind of talk about it's part of your personality. They say like it's something you kind of learn how to do and it becomes part of your character and your relationship to people. We had someone mention that she broke up with her boyfriend because she was tired of him being late all the time. Or maybe he reformed himself. Sometimes if we tell people it's really personally hurtful, they'll fix their lateness. But it's just like it's a good question to ask yourself, especially if you're going to be asked this question in a job interview, or if you have any sort of situations where you may end up being late. You may want to be able to tell the person, like, I'm sometimes late. Just understand it's not personal. I'm trying to work on it, right? It's good to know about yourself. So that's why we're talking about it. Okay. So last but not least, because, you guys let me know if there's any other comments you have about this in your culture. Last but not least, we're going to talk about, do you have an expression like your culture time? Right? So I've heard a lot of people say Argentine time, for example, like in Argentina, they said Argentine time. I've heard people say Arab time. I've heard people say Israeli time. I've heard people say in the United States, Southern time, right? Because time is different between people of a different culture. And this is why, the international world is so fascinating and so wonderful, but you kind of have to have this cultural understanding of each other and understand where people are coming from, understand what their perspective is, how they feel about being on time, and how they feel about these things, because you might not share the same cultural language. You might not share the same understanding of what's appropriate. And that's why I love talking about this in my videos. This is my personal interest and even why I started teaching. So do you have expressions in your different cultures about, like Argentine time, Arab time, Israeli time? I've heard people say these before. German time, like people, and I know in Chile they would say, if you wanted somebody to be on time, you would say English time, right? So like the punctuality would be English time. So I'd love to hear if you have like Brazilian time, for example, if people say, oh, he's just on Brazilian time, which means that his internal clock is a little different than American time. So yeah, it's just a very interesting thing to understand. And like I said, since this is a cultural thing, being on time is cultural, you also have to understand if you're interacting with an American, and I'm sure it's similar in other English speaking cultures, but I'm American, so I'm not positive. But Americans feel frustrated with a delay. So it's not just about you being late, like a person showing up late, but we get frustrated, like you get emotional, like frustrated, anger, angst. You get frustrated with delays, like a delay at the airport, a delay, the start time of a concert, even though they always start late. People get like, oh, like, when's this going to start? Even if there's an interruption before a TV program where there's some news situation and they come in with the news, people get frustrated. And it's, for me, one of the best things about living in other cultures is that I decided, like, I don't get that frustrated about other people's lateness, because really, is it really that important? I mean, it is in a job interview. It is if you have an official meeting, if somebody's very busy. But like, I usually think that there's more important things to worry about. So I try to be more, like, less emotional about delays. Like, and I always try to be prepared. I don't have it close to me, but I always read a book. I always have something I can do. And that's something you realize, like, especially if you're always early to something, you get used to waiting. So it's not, you're used to having a book to read or something to read on your phone. But it's just important to understand that if you're late with an American, there's a chance that they will get frustrated. So you kind of want to respect their culture, especially if you're living in the US. You kind of want to respect how they feel about it. And you also want to respect how your friends or your romantic partners feel about it. The people you care most, your family, if you care about them, try to understand their feelings. Like, maybe like me, I'm more flexible, but if I know somebody hates that if I'm late to something, I will make a good effort to be there on time, right? And that's why a lot of times when Americans live in places like Argentina or places where there's a lot of bureaucracy, where there's a lot of waiting in line, Americans have to be taught to wait. Americans are taught by people who are kind of cultural ambassadors to learn how to wait, because it's part of the culture. And if you can't be an American American and go to another country, I mean, people do this, but you can't, going to another country and expecting it to run your way isn't really fair either. Like, I wouldn't go to our friend to Nigeria and show up 30 minutes early to a party. I'd probably show up 3 hours late because he said that's what to expect at a party. So that's why I said, like, in Argentina, I started to try to respect the culture, and I started showing up a little bit late. Obviously, I still showed up early to that birthday party I mentioned earlier, but I was like an hour late. I think I showed up 45 minutes late. I think I walked around it was nighttime. That was the other reason. Because it was night, I didn't want to walk around by myself. In the daytime, I would show up late on purpose. So it's just something to understand. Like, if the cross-cultural nature of our wonderful global world is that you have to kind of respect the culture that you're in. And I always try to adapt to the culture I'm living in. So when I'm in the United States, I'm much more punctual. When I'm living in other countries, unless I'm showing up for a class, I tend to be more flexible and I tend to forgive people more. So it's just something to understand. And the other thing I want to mention about being late in the United States is that in some jobs, chronic tardiness or chronic consistent tardiness, which is being late, or chronic lateness is grounds for firing. So if you're trying to work in the US, and I'm sure I'll have stories of people who have lived in the United States and may have heard of friends getting fired for being late. You just want to understand that for some jobs, being late is a reason to get fired. You really have to understand the culture of the job you're in, not just the American culture approach. Or because some cities are different, some companies are different. There are companies when you can come and go. I had a job where they really didn't care. I've had a few jobs where it didn't really matter what time I showed up as long as my work was done. So it really just depends. Yeah. So, and the last advice to give on this as well is that if you know that you're late, you should kind of plan to be early and give yourself some time so that you're not being late. So it's just something to consider. Okay. Question I kind of want to leave you guys with today is, how can you ensure that you're on time, especially if interacting with an American or interacting with someone from a country? Like, a lot of our European friends or Asian friends have said that punctuality is really important. So I want you to think about, how can you ensure you're on time? How can you be more punctual? And you may need some time to think about this. So please feel free to leave a comment below the video after you watch the replay and have some time to think about this. But how can you ensure that you're on time? How can you be more punctual? And a lot of times this is something people have to practice. This is kind of a professional skill of being punctual that you have to learn if you weren't raised in a family where punctuality was important. My dad was always early and my mom was always punctual. So I kind of knew that punctuality was important. But if you don't have that, you kind of have to learn how to do it. And a lot of times people say to think about how much time you really need, to be honest with yourself about how much time you need to get there. A lot of times when people have job interviews, they try commuting to the job interview before the actual interview so that they don't show up late, because punctuality is really important in job interviews. And actually, that's another thing to mention is we're talking about showing up professionally on time and showing up on time to social events. So people have different approaches to that, and we've had a couple of people mentioning here. Oh yeah, and I'll look at the chat in just a moment. We have a couple people mentioning here that, they feel hurt if their friends show up late or aren't punctual and don't respect their time. So you have to kind of consider, like, do you know the person? How do they feel about you showing up early? Most people don't like to show up early to social events or even on time because they don't want to be the first one to arrive. So it's just things to consider. And if you guys think of anything else after the video, please be sure to leave a comment and tell us. Okay, to get your free guide here and join my email community at englishwithkim.com/smalltalkguide. You can also sign up for email reminders of these live lessons, because I try to do them every week and I try to schedule them in advance. Sometimes it doesn't happen. So the link for that is below the video if you want to sign up for email reminders and be sure you don't miss any of these live lessons. You can also click the bell on my YouTube channel in order to get notified. So I thank you guys so much for your participation. This was really fun. I'm glad I learned a lot about different parts of the world and different approaches to time and punctuality. What else can I say? Oh, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I haven't checked to see if you've been giving me the thumbs up, but it really does help more people find the video, more people watch the video. If you like this discussion, you want more like this, leave a comment. Let me know if you like these discussions where we include a little more about culture and we compare culture. That's my personal interest, so I'm trying to introduce it into these live sessions so you feel like you really are having a conversation over tea or coffee with me. If you have any friends who you think would benefit from joining us in these live sessions, be sure to share this video. It really does mean a lot. It really does help more people find the English with Kim YouTube channel, and the more people who join, the more I can show up for you guys. You really are supporting me, and I appreciate it. So once again, I'm Kim from EnglishWithKim.com. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope you think a little bit about punctuality a little bit differently. I hope we all had a great conversation. And once again, give me a thumbs up if you like this video. Be sure to share it. And I look forward to sharing more tips with you soon. Have a good one. Goodbye.